Okay, welcome everybody to this study of the book of Nehemiah. We're working through this book chapter by chapter, helping us to understand the key themes that this book draws out and what it means for us today. We're looking at chapter 2 today, and we're going to begin by reading some of the verses, and then we're going to discuss some of the key themes. And so we're going to begin by reading verses 1 to 6, and it reads like this. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before, so the king asked me, "Why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart." I was very much afraid, but I said to the king, "May the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" The king said to me, "What is it you want?" Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried, so that I can rebuild it." And then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, "How long will your journey take, and when will you get back?" And it pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. And so, Dr. John, these verses, they follow on from the first chapter where Nehemiah has heard about the desolation of Jerusalem and the state that it is in, its walls burned down. And here we see the narrative move forwards. And Nehemiah goes to the king, he sees his downcast countenance, and he's concerned. What does that concern of the king for Nehemiah tell us?
I think it says there that Nehemiah had not appeared sad in the king's presence before, so this was unusual. So the king was kind of thinking, what is happening there? He's not ill, why is he sad? He had an important position, a responsible, close position as cupbearer to the king. And so these two people would have known each other very well. They could have picked up the vibes, as it were. And it shows also the king was concerned, had some compassion, which was not a typical quality of kings, certainly that era. So he had a caring nature. He didn't have to do that. Now, it's interesting because the theologian Rogers, he comments that, and he quotes, "It's not permitted to be gloomy in the royal presence. That is not a wise thing to do. The king does want unhappy people around him. It would be very unwise to appear sad for fear of rousing their wrath and with possible disastrous consequences." And it says he was afraid, was Nehemiah, because he's kind of thinking, well, he's really like, I'm sad. I should be happy in his presence. What's he going to do? Is he going to get angry with me? And again, the theologian Schultz made an interesting comment that God had ordained that Nehemiah should have been in that position, a king's cupbearer. In a similar way, when we're reading Esther, she became queen. And he quote from Esther 4:14, "for a time such as this." Right. And in that sense, Nehemiah was given that position by God for this particular time to carry out a particular duty.
That's so interesting. And we see the fruit of Nehemiah being in that position in the sense that he then is ultimately sent back to Jerusalem there. And that kind of makes sense when you talk about Nehemiah's response being one of fear, because actually that's not something that he quote unquote should have, something he should have displayed in the king's presence. But Pastor Fraser, ultimately the king, he does release Nehemiah to go back to Jerusalem, which some might think when you're reading it, that almost seems surprising.
Yeah, it seems very, very surprising. As Dr. John said, the king, especially of an empire such as this, that was ruthless, that was crazy. I mean, they took over Babylon, like as we were talking about in the last episode. Like, this was a ruthless takeover. Like, these guys are not nice people, yet the compassion he shows it is quite incredible. And I think that must be put down to God working in his heart and God being at work in here using a secular means to fulfill God's purpose. And the date at the start is very significant as well. If we look at the date in the month of Nisan in the 20th year of the king. So Nehemiah from chapter 1 has spent 4 months. He's heard about this, and he's spent 4 months praying, fasting, mourning. This has been getting at him for 4 months, and then this is the day where he comes before the king in this kind of a sad state. So he's been praying. So God's clearly at work, and there's also scholars note that there was possible strategic planning in the waiting. The month of Nisan is the start of the year, and Herodotus preserves the detail that special favors were granted on the Persian monarch's birthday. So New Year, it's a time of celebration. Everyone's happy, yet Nehemiah's miserable. So this is almost such a stark contrast. And according to the Greek historian, it was held that no one who asked like a request on that day at the king's board should be denied his request. So this may explain the delay and the fact it was granted, and even the wisdom that Nehemiah comes to this. And I think this is a key point. Even, he then I prayed. You see this throughout Nehemiah. Then I prayed, then he prayed, then he prayed. He prays, he brings it to God, but there's also massive wisdom with how he comes to God, because even with how he comes to the king, because he says, where my ancestors are buried. So Persians, they have a massive respect for the dead. So him saying this is almost like he's kind of having this very strategic conversation with the king. He's not just saying, the walls are down, and he's coming in this really emotional state. It's like his heart's burdened, but there's also wisdom and great strategy to what he says.
There's so much in that. There's so much in that, isn't there? That's brilliant. And so there's Nehemiah, prayerful man, been praying and fasting for 4 months. And then he's, but not only has he prayed, but he's also acted strategically. It's kind of the both and.
And can I just clarify on that as well? Like, actually, yes, he was strategic, but actually God is the sovereign provider. Is that he prayed before and he prays during. This is the key thing we can take, is not just that Nehemiah was smart, but actually that God's at work in this.
Right. Right. We even see in Nehemiah chapter 1, the final verse, it is Nehemiah praying, give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man. Amy, one of the points that Pastor Fraser drew out there was, in the heat of the moment, Nehemiah, whilst in conversation with the king, it says that he prayed.
Yeah.
What can we learn from that?
I mean, so much. I think Nehemiah is such a brilliant example to us in terms of leadership, and leadership is essentially just influence. So we all have levels of leadership, and the fact that we see that Nehemiah prayed, and fasted for 4 months, but even then, just in that moment as well, he prayed just, a short snippet prayer to God. I think it's brilliant to see that balance between praying and fasting and believing for something, for a really long time. But equally, we can actually have access to God at all times. And even, in that split second, just his immediate response was, I need God on this. I need to pray about this. It wasn't his last resort, but it was his first resource. And I think that's really important for us to go out and know that actually, that should be our first response, is to pray in times of need.
That's brilliant. Prayer should not be, prayer should not be our last response.
Our last resort, but our first resource.
Not our last resort, but our first resource. I love that. And it's almost all the more surprising, the fact that this king sends them back, because when we look at the book of Ezra, we've commented Nehemiah just falls just after Esther. It's the very same king that had told Ezra and the other companions to stop building work previously. And so it's just all the more that sense of God's favor on Nehemiah is just so evident. Any further comment on these kind of beginning verses, Laulu, on how Nehemiah is commissioned by the king and he ends up being sent back?
Yes, absolutely. And I think, people have already touched on it as well. But, looking at how Nehemiah took this step, as, was mentioned, it took 4 months, prayer and fasting before he then had this conversation with the king. And Dr. John drew parallels with Esther. I think we see, even in Esther's time, when she had to have a similar conversation with the king, she had her life at risk, in the same way that actually Nehemiah, anything could have happened. Going into this, he wasn't sure if, the king would, react terribly, would send him to death, because that was a major possibility in these times. But again, I think it just shows the courage of his convictions of Nehemiah. He chose to take this step. This could have been seen as a sign of disrespect to the king, but actually through prayer and fasting and believing that actually God would work, that actually God did work. And I think it shows, again, prayer is answered by God. Like this isn't just something that we speak about. This is something that happens. We see evidence of this as well. And I just think it's just really incredible to see the courage of Nehemiah, to see the favor of God as well. And I think it shows that God had favor for Nehemiah in those times. We still have the favor of God upon us today. And I think that's just something that's really evident at the start of this chapter.
It's brilliant. So next time you find yourself in a high pressure scenario, pray about it ahead of time. And even in the moment, we can go to God and pray about it too. And something we even hit on in the opening chapter was just on Nehemiah's looking to the wants of God and God's desires, and also the needs of others. And the fact that you mentioned courage, Laulu, is so poignant, because here's Nehemiah in the opulence of a palace, in a secure position, and he's giving that up to us to go back and serve his people and serve the purposes of God. It's a very inspirational move from Nehemiah. A lot happens in chapter 2. We're actually going to read a few more verses from verses 17 to 20 now. Since then, the king has sent Nehemiah back to Jerusalem with letters to grant him passage, with resources. He arrives back and he's looking around the walls with some of his companions. And verse 17 reads like this: "Then I said to them, you see the trouble we're in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me, and what the king had said to me. They replied, let us start rebuilding. So they began this good work. But when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. 'What is this you're doing?' they asked. 'Are you rebelling against the king?' I answered them by saying, 'The God of heaven will give us success. We are his servants. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. But as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any historic right to it.'" And so much happens in these verses and in this whole chapter. In fact, Dr. John, I'm sure we're just scratching the surface a little bit, but can you just touch on what Nehemiah refers to in verse 18? Why is Nehemiah sharing this with his companions? What he says of, I also told them about the gracious hand of God on me.
Yes, see, the hand of God was there. I think that the encouragement he gave the people was the fact that they've got the king with all this authority, but God gives the authority to the kings. Mm-hmm. And thinking back, this is a theme that goes through the whole Bible, the Old Testament, the New Testament. Daniel wrote about this. I'll quote from Daniel 2:21 about God. "He changes times and seasons. He deposes kings and he raises others up. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning." And going centuries later into the New Testament, when Jesus is in front of Pilate, and Pilate said, "I have authority to crucify you." And Jesus says, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above." So I think the message there that Nehemiah is getting across is that God is in control. And God is moving on the king to be gracious to them. And so that's a great encouragement that God is there. And irrespective of the authority of the king, God will work out his purposes.
That's really helpful. And just a follow-up question on that, Pastor Fraser, I mean, how does that mean that we should interpret the actions of others? What I mean is, Nehemiah, he prays to God and asks for favor when he speaks to the king, and obviously the king hears him, he sends him back, and Nehemiah then testifies that was God's gracious hand on my life. So when we pray and when maybe prayers get answered or don't get answered, is that simply, it's a sign of God's pleasure or displeasure with us? Or how can we kind of navigate how God responds to our prayers?
I think that God's got a plan. I think, as Dr. John was just saying, like God's above it all. Like he deposes kings. Like he knows what he's doing. And prayer is not so much about me changing God's mind, but me aligning my heart and my mind with God's plan and getting wisdom. Like you notice that Nehemiah prayed for 4 months. He didn't just pray once and said, "Right, I'm going to the king. No, I prayed for 4 months. So there's a sense of having that wisdom and that intimacy. And when, I'm communicating with God, it's not that he's a vending machine that is just like, give me this, give me this, give me this. It's actually me aligning myself with him. And, I may not always get the answers that I necessarily want in this season, but I know that God's for me. I know that he's with me, and that God loves us and he knows what's best for us. And sometimes we may think that we know what's best for us, but actually God knows what's best. His timing is perfect. Like you said earlier, like Ezra, they tried to rebuild. I guess that's why he's saying this. Let's start rebuilding. Like God's with us on this. Like these guys, they've already tried to build it. So they've got the disgrace of the walls around them. They see all this, and then they start to rebuild them, and then all of a sudden, it doesn't work, and then they're just discouraged. They're down. They're almost out, aren't they? You can kind of get that sense of this kind of sense of just discouragement. And then Nehemiah comes in and says, "No, we can do this." And there could be this sense of, "Oh no, we can't." Yet he encourages them as well. So I think there's a sense of like just being in tune with God through our prayers. Does that make sense? I don't know if I answered your question.
I think that's really helpful. Just aligning our hearts to God and trusting no matter what that He's in control. And things certainly move at pace, Amy, in this chapter. A lot happens. I mean, Nehemiah, he's a man of action, isn't he? As well as being a man of prayer, he's a man of action. Like, he gets back to Jerusalem, he wastes no time. He's looking around the walls and everything. Why the sense of urgency for Nehemiah here?
I think it's twofold. I think you've got to look at the build up to this moment. We've previously mentioned that there's been 4 months of prayer, but then actually there's got to be the travel to sort of get to Jerusalem, and that took 4 months as well. And so then at this point, Nehemiah takes 3 days to rest and then goes out and assesses the walls. So, it shows the importance of rest. But then he's like, okay, we've got to get this done now. There's a point where, you've got to act. And I think he knows that God's behind him. He's prayed about it. He's seen the hand of God over King Artaxerxes. And actually, there has to come a point where it's like, okay, and now we've got to start doing it and got to start taking action. But I think as well, it's really important to note the importance of the walls as well. Without a city walls, a city was vulnerable, was weak, was insecure, was open to attack at any moment, and nothing of value could be kept. Previously, Zerubbabel had come and rebuilt the temple, but they couldn't keep anything of value in the temple because it would just get stolen. And so actually the rebuilding of the wall, it was also really about rebuilding the people as well. It was about bringing strength and defense back to Jerusalem. And it's really about, I guess, showing that actually God's people were on the rise again. God's people were coming back, and we'll, I guess, talk about it in a little bit, but the enemies really didn't like this. They didn't like seeing Jerusalem and the people of God coming back into it.
Yeah, you get that sense of Nehemiah. He knows that God's hand is with them. So it's like, all right, let's not mess about here. Let's get down to business. Let's get going. And in verse 19, we meet some people, you alluded, Amy, to, they start to mock the work, Dr. John, that has begun, and they're being discouraging to the efforts there. And so what do we know about these people, these opposers, and what can we learn from how Nehemiah responds?
Basically, these people, Sanballat and his colleagues, if you call them, or whatever, but they were from nations that in the past historically had opposed Israel. And again, as Amy was saying, that building the walls was a kind of sign of strength, a sign that the city was getting back on its feet.
Yeah.
And the last thing that they wanted was that. They wanted them kept down, as it were. They didn't want them to be recovering. And it was that kind of historic hatred between them. And they that's why there's that fierce opposition. Now, Nehemiah could have buckled under that. He could have said, I want to build the walls, but really this is too much. This is really too much, because not just of the insults, but there's a threat to our lives here. But he didn't. He put his trust in God, and he put his. Looking at the book of Nehemiah, it goes back through the history of how God had taken care of his people, from crossing the Red Sea. Many times God had worked miracles for his people. And it was that trust in God, that the God who did miracles and cared for his people in the past is the God of the present. The God doesn't change. And it was that trust that with God's help, he's going to do it, despite any opposition that comes.
Yeah.
And that message is the same in the New Testament through the letters, where we're encouraged to fight against evil, put on the armour of God, to stand, because we have the victory in God. And he was doing the same type of thing. He was standing in the strength of God, not his own strength, but God's strength, and trusting in God, who proved in the past to be faithful.
Yeah.
But it wasn't easy at the time. And I think looking at what strikes me in verse 18, particularly the latter part of it, is it says here, let us start rebuilding. Well, that's great. And anybody can have good ideas. Oh, that's a good idea. Let's do this, let's do that. And there's nothing wrong with that. But then, just after that, it says, they began the good work. And they had that faith in God to put it into action.
Yeah.
And Jesus said that the man who trusts in God and builds his house on a rock is the one who hears the words and put them into practice.
Yeah.
And James says the same thing. It's no use just saying something and believing something. You've got to put that into practice.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what they did. They said, let's start, but they actually did it.
Yeah.
But it through that faith in God. And of course, today, we have opposition in different parts of the world, have even fiercer opposition. There can be insults, there can be things going against us. But I think it's important to bear in mind, like Nehemiah did, that the God of the past is the God of the present. He doesn't change. And the examples we see in the Old Testament and the New Testament of God working, of God caring, of God showing compassion for his people, he's the same God.
Yeah.
And we can trust in him.
Yeah. You almost, it's very encouraging, Dr. John, and you almost put yourself in Nehemiah's shoes, don't you? And you think, man, he's not long been off this very long journey from the Persian Empire. He's arrived back, sees his city in ruins. He's got this enormous task before him of rebuilding all these walls. He's got a down and out kind of people he's trying to lead to get it all done. And on top of that, he's facing these people who are discouraging him. I mean, we're going to meet them again later on, just a heads up. But what's Nehemiah's response? Does he say, trust in God? And I love this, just as we draw to a close. This says, we, his servants, will start rebuilding. I think there's such wisdom in that when it comes to working out the will of God in our lives and trying to live by faith, we can trust God with the big outcome. If we can just start and trust God, then we can know that God will be with us. That's Nehemiah chapter 2. I'd encourage you to go and read the whole chapter, and we'll see you next week.